Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica Vargas Stidvent, Executive Director of the Center for Women in Law. Thank you for joining us today for our installment of the Susan Blount Power Lunch series, a conversation with Liz Avore, hosted by Mimi Marziani. Our Power Lunch series showcases the career paths of prominent attorneys and public figures in an informal environment. Today's event has been approved for 1 hour of CLE by the Texas State Bar. If you're watching us live in Zoom, you'll receive an email this afternoon with information about how to claim your credit. If you happen to be joining us by phone, and I think we've got some people who are calling in, please let us know that you attended today by sending an email to us at Center for Women in Law, that's all one word, Center for Women in Law at law.utexas.edu. And throughout today's discussion, feel free to post your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Center for Women in Law is a national resource and champion for women lawyers, generating lasting change within the legal profession. And we pursue our mission in a variety of ways, including programs like today's event, which is sponsored by the Hortense Ward Speakers Fund. We're very grateful for that support and for supporters like so many of you watching today. Gifts of any amount support the many programs and initiatives at the center and advance our mission. And we thank you so much for your generosity. So now let's meet our Power Lunch speaker and conversation hosts. So welcome, Liz and Mimi. Hi. So Liz Avore is Senior Policy Advisor at Voting Rights Lab, and she's the leading national expert on election legislation and policy development. With a particular focus on policy that impacts voter access and election administration, her analysis has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Post, NPR, and a number of other media outlets. She previously served as the managing director for law and policy at Everytown for Gun Safety, where she built the policy department for the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country. She also served as assistant attorney general for the country of Palau, and she was an associate at Greenberg Traurig. Liz has her JD from Duke University, and she earned her BA from the University of Michigan. So welcome, Liz. We're also excited to be joined today by Mimi Marziani, who's the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project, a position she assumed in 2016 at the very young age of 33. She has an extensive background in civil rights advocacy, nonprofit management, and Texas politics, and she is a nationally recognized expert in voting rights and election law. As such, she's regularly featured in the press in a variety of public forums and before the U.S. Congress and other governmental organizations. She also teaches here at the University of Texas School of Law, and she serves on the NYU School of Law Board of Trustees. In 2020, she was recognized with an Austin Under 40 award. Prior to her time at the Texas Civil Rights Project, she led voting rights efforts for political organizations, including running the first coordinated statewide voter protection program for progressive candidates in Texas in 2014. Mimi also worked as counsel for the democracy program of the Brennan Center for Justice in New York City, where she litigated voting rights cases across the country. And she was also an associate at Sullivan and Cromwell. She clerked for U.S. Magistrate Judge for the Southern District of New York, the Honorable James Francis, and she earned her JD from NYU School of Law and her BA from Vanderbilt University. So welcome, Liz and Mimi. We're really excited to have you two talk about your career paths and voting rights legislation.
All right, well, thank you so much. Again, as everybody heard, in addition to all the other things I do, I am so proud to be an adjunct professor at University of Texas. So it is a particular pleasure to be here today. And during my day job at the Texas Civil Rights Project, I am very proud to be a partner of Voting Rights Lab and actually worked particularly closely with the Voting Rights Lab in 2021 when the Texas Civil Rights Project and Voting Rights Lab were pushing back against proposed legislation in Texas that would restrict voting. And so, Liz, it's really a pleasure to be here in a less formal setting to have this conversation. So I thought I'd start more in the personal realm and just, you and I have crossed paths quite a bit. I know we are both moms of young kids, lawyers, like voting and democracy, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your professional path and what led you to the position you hold today.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, so I discovered state legislative policy just over a decade ago and really fell in love with it and never looked back. But before that,
By the way, I've worked with enough state legislative policy to say not a lot of people say that.
Oh man, I am a devotee. Yes, but before that, I did work on, a couple different areas of law. I worked in trademark litigation at a big law firm. I spent a few years as an assistant attorney general in an island nation in the Pacific. And then when I returned to the US in early 2012, I started working on gun violence prevention. And it really quickly became apparent to me that the changes to gun law were all happening at the state level. But with everybody's focus and attention on Congress, no one was really paying attention to all of these significant changes that were being made in state legislatures. And the truth is, it's really hard to follow what's happening in state legislative policy, particularly on a national level. And so when I started with Voting Rights Lab about 4 years ago, my first goal was to create a tool to really provide transparency into what was happening in state election law. At Voting Rights Lab, we track like over 2,000 pieces of legislation that are introduced each year. We have a state voting rights tracker that we use to do this and to display it to the public. And people are always shocked to learn that, we're talking over 2,000 bills that are introduced across the country that are related to legislation. And it's hard, for anyone without some kind of tool or access to understand kind of what that process is and what is actually becoming law and what the trends are and what matters in their state. So our focus is to provide transparency into what is otherwise a pretty opaque process. And that's kind of where a lot of my passion lies, is actually creating a window for folks to see what is happening in their state legislature so they can do something about it. And what we do is we provide plain English summaries for each bill, and we categorize the bills into buckets based on the policy, the state, the impact, the stage of the legislative process it is. Essentially, we're turning legislation into data, which is a bit of a data nerd, so I love it that we're able to do that and enable national trends to emerge, actually to see what those national trends are, and to drill down and also understand the nitty-gritties about the specific laws. But we make this available to the public because the goal is to shed some light on, what I said was just like this very opaque process that everyone from journalists to state-based organizations to citizens just don't really have a window into otherwise. And, state legislation is the way that the vast majority of the law in our country is made, which is why when I first started working on policy, I was so drawn to it. And I think it's just critical that we understand the national trends. It's critical that media and organizations in the space and citizens all have access to the information so that coverage of election law is accurate, and to ensure that partner organizations have the information and the policy support they need to do their jobs well. And this is sort of I think through all the different things I've done in my career, I'm just become through and through a state legislative nerd, and love talking about it. And I'm excited about this conversation.
It's such an interesting place. And, I think you and I have a lot of similarities in the fact that I also started my career in New York City. And after I have some former colleagues from Sullivan and Cromwell who are doing on-campus interview right now. So got some amazing complex litigation training there. Spent several years at the Brennan Center for Justice, where I actually did a bit of state work, but to your point, the Brennan Center very much has a national lens, and national legislation is always a big focus. And it wasn't until I had done that work for several years that I had the opportunity to come to Texas in 2014, first for political work, and then to step into my role at the Texas Civil Rights Project. And so, I think I've seen firsthand what you're talking about, that there does tend to be a gap between these like incredible, in my view, places like the Brennan Center that do the policy analysis at the national level, groups like mine that we're community lawyering organizations. So we're providing go-to legal counsel for community groups on the ground we have a lot of expertise about Texas law, but I know some of the ways that we worked with you last year was helping us understand, this law that we see in Texas, how does it compare to what's being introduced in Georgia and Arizona and Florida, and where can we start pulling similarities? And actually, one of the things that was very cool about the work that TCRP did last year in the legislative session was reaching out to groups like yours on the national level for that hard data, and then reaching out to community groups in places like Georgia and trying to understand from an advocacy standpoint, what strategies we could borrow. So it's really it's really fun to hear your kind of different vantage point on that sort of work.
Yeah, no, I love hearing that. It's like, as you said, there's so many tremendous organizations in the voting space that have been working on these issues for so long. And Voting Rights Lab is a fairly new organization. And like, as we were kind of, figuring out, what our role was, we were kind of looking for those gaps. And it's like really kind of, it's great to hear that it's like, oh yeah, there was this gap between in there where we weren't seeing, the state legislation looked at at this national level. And that is kind of what we, the goal is to make the movement stronger and to fill the gaps that were there.
Totally. Well, I mean, because we are less than a week out from the midterm, I do want to move to talk about that and voting rights trends. Before we get there, though, one more question that I get asked a lot, and I'm guessing you get asked a lot, which is, some version of, do you have any advice for particularly lawyers or law students who might be watching, people who are earlier in their career and thinking about, I think some combination of you could go either direction with this question. One question I get a lot is like the family. As I said, I have two daughters, a first grader and a 4-year-old. I know you have at least one young child too. Talking about that balance between work and family and any advice you have on that. And then I think maybe a second area of advice is, I loved hearing your work internationally and some other things you've done with your career. If you have any thoughts for aspiring public interest students and advice on how to navigate the less clear-cut path that nonprofit law often takes you down. Yeah,
another great question. And I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on this maybe too after I answer it, because I don't think there is kind of like, one piece of advice that's gonna work for everyone. Everyone's path is different, but absolutely, like, I'm 42 years old now, and like what works for me in my career right now is so different than what worked for me 10 years ago when I was just like completely like focused solely on work, and it was all it was my hobby and my job all at the same time. And I do think that like as we grow in our careers, there are definitely paths that lawyers can take that give us the space to be present for our young families, while at the same time continuing to do the work that we're passionate about and we've built expertise in. And for me, for example, I kind of led two policy groups at two different organizations, at Everytown for Gun Safety and at Voting Rights Lab. And it got to the point where it was kind of taking up a little bit, it was taking up more space for me than I was comfortable with my kind of my growing family. And I was able to kind of step into a new role where I'm now a senior policy advisor at the Voting Rights Lab. I'm able to use the expertise I built in policy and be able to still contribute to the work that I'm so passionate about, but kind of step into a position that's a little bit more part-time, a little bit more flexible. And I think that those types of opportunities are available. And I think it's just a matter of, kind of seeking them out and, figuring out what works for your lifestyle and your mental health and your career all at the same time. And I think it is too often that women feel like they have to just, stop working entirely because the balance isn't working. And I think my biggest piece of advice would just to be encourage folks to seek out that like a balance that works for you, and to kind of, recognize that even if you can't work 60 hours a week anymore, there's still a tremendous amount of value that you can bring to the field. And I'm curious about what you think about this too, actually, because I don't claim to know all the answers. It's my path.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that there's no one answer. I mean, I completely agree, both with this idea of balance and also that it's really individualized. And I think it differs at different times of your life. And I was actually just telling a student of mine yesterday, I think it is very helpful to, you know, you don't need to, no one knows exactly what their career is going to look like 10 years from now. And I think that it is very helpful to think about your career in a longer arc, because there are going to be times, it's just, it is the nature of law. There's going to be times when, whether it's a trial, whether it's an election, whether it's, whatever is coming up, a big deal, you're a corporate lawyer, that you might have to really spend a lot of time working, and that is going to be like the sole or primary focus. I do also think it's important then to think after that, what else is in my life? I mean, I also had phases of my life where people asked what my hobbies were. Somebody asked my husband this once several years ago, and he was like, I think her hobby is working. Is that her hobby?
When you're passionate about your work,
right.
That's what happens.
And so I do think that it's important to just keep asking yourself, is this the right balance? And recognize that, where your balance might be over here might not be the same 6 months from now. And that's probably healthy to make sure that you don't burn out and that you're able to sustain. I'll say another thing for me that I thought about a lot more recently is, lawyers tend to be very risk adverse, which is good in many ways. If you're counseling a client, I have been in the capacity of being an in-house lawyer, and you do want to be very risk adverse in that capacity. At the same time, I think that sometimes lawyers, and I think particularly women, are overly cautious in their own career, and sometimes hold themselves back by not taking calculated risks, because sometimes a calculated risk is not going to work out. And I think that having the confidence and the assurance to know that if you take a little bit of a risk, it doesn't work out, that there's almost always ways that you can backtrack and recalibrate. I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. And for me, a huge pivot point in my career was coming to Texas. And honestly, I didn't want to come. I love living and practicing in New York. And I was also feeling a little stuck and unsure about my next path. And actually, a mentor of mine at NYU told me to come and work on Wendy Davis's gubernatorial campaign in 2014, which is what I ended up doing. And his advice was, basically, what's the worst that can happen? You can go, maybe it's a disaster, and then the election comes and you can leave. And instead I came and I realized how exciting I thought the political landscape in Texas was, how exciting it was to be on the front lines of these voting rights issues I had examined for many years in New York. And also, for me personally, there was I think a lot more leadership opportunity at the state level than at the national level. And so all of that led me to stay in Texas. And it was a bit of a risk. And I think that it was a really good decision.
Yeah, no, I love that frame. I think that makes a lot of sense. And there is something you said earlier that really kind of resonated with me, is that the need just to continually kind of reassess your career and what's working for you right now, and what balance is working for you in this moment, because it's kind of impossible to predict that. And it's something that you just kind of you kind of assess as it's going on. I don't consider myself to be in any way kind of at the end of my career. I'm in the middle of it right now, and it's gonna, things are gonna continue to change for me as I go on. And I think that is, I think at the beginning of your career, it's really easy just to think like, oh, it's going to be this straight trajectory, and I kind of know everything that's going to happen. And the truth is, it's like anything in life where you just kind of keep reassessing as you go, and be willing to take those risks when they come up and when they arise, and to kind of have the confidence and trust in yourself to do that.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to use that segue, the segue of reassessing. to move, because we are now, Thursday? We're just days away from the midterm. And because I know you are someone who very closely watches, what's happening in all of the states and then zooms out to figure out national trends, I would love to hear your thoughts on what are we seeing in the states? What are the big trends that are happening this midterm election? What is making you nervous or excited as you are looking to Tuesday?
Yeah.
And I have some thoughts on this stuff too, largely from Texas.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts also. Yeah. So, over the past couple of years, since the 2020 election, what we've seen in the States is this divide that's developing and really deepening over the past couple of years, where we're seeing some states who are enacting laws to expand ballot access, and others that have made it a lot more difficult to vote over the past couple of years. And the result is that, we're seeing these two different democracies almost develop in our country, where a voter's zip code determines their level of ballot access. And that's concerning. And I think that mail voting really epitomizes this divide right now. Voting by mail was growing in popularity even before 2020. And the 2020 election really catalyzed its popularity. So in the years following that election, we've seen a lot of new state laws that govern vote by mail. And, some states have passed laws that really increase access to mail voting, and then others have passed laws that restrict it. Nevada is an example of a state that passed, pretty significant legislation that is increasing access to mail voting. They just recently started sending mail ballots to all registered voters. So before each election in Nevada, every registered voter receives a ballot in the mail. They can fill out and return that ballot by mail, or they can drop it off at the clerk's office or at a drop box, or they can ignore the ballot and just vote in person at a polling place on election day or during the early voting period. And this concept is actually very popular in the West. A lot of Nevada's neighbors, including Colorado, where I live, and Utah and California, they all send ballots to all registered voters before each election.
I mean, in Colorado, some of those states, I know Colorado, Oregon, they have been primarily vote by mail now, right? For about a decade.
Yeah. So, so it's funny because I lived in New York for a long time before I lived in Colorado. And at the time that I was living in New York, there was no mail voting, really, no early voting. You just kind of went to the polling place on election day. And I found that once I moved to Colorado and I received a ballot in the mail before every local election, before every single election, I found that I was much more likely to vote in all the smaller elections, and I didn't face any significant barriers. But just having that ballot come in the mail, I think it just makes it more likely you're going to fill it out and return it. But it is true that there are some folks who don't want to use that mail ballot, and states like Colorado, California, Utah, Nevada, they do, it's more like an option, right? You have this easy option to vote by mail, but if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. You can also go in and cast a ballot in person at a polling place. And, many folks still do that because that's their preference. It's really what we're finding is that there's no one size fits all for voting. So the more options that you provide, the more people are going to be included in the democracy. We saw, Virginia passed a variant on this where they just recently created a permanent mail voting list where you can sign up and voluntarily receive. And if you sign up on this list, then you'll get a mail ballot in the mail before each election. But if you don't sign up for it, you won't. But yeah, like I said, this is the good news, but there is a divide that we're seeing in the country where there are some states that have passed pretty significant legislation to make it more difficult to vote by mail than it was in 2020, certainly, and even before that. For example, we saw in Florida, in Georgia, and your state of Texas, they all passed new barriers to mail voting, including ID requirements that for mail ballots that have made it more difficult to vote by mail, but also, as we've seen in the Texas primaries, less likely that their person's ballot will be counted if they vote by mail, which is obviously concerning. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I'll say in Texas, I totally agree with your assessment of this, sadly, what seems to be a growing divide between ease of access. And I just want to underline that because I think that that's something that anybody who is thinking seriously about our democracy should be concerned about. And to my knowledge, I'm not like a comparative democracy person. I don't know that much about democracies in other countries, but it strikes me as highly unusual that we in our country tolerate such wide disparities between, your ability to vote based on, as you put it, your zip code. And voting by mail in Texas has long been, even before it was expanded by so many states in 2020, Texas is one of the only states that requires an excuse to vote by mail. So it's highly limited to start with. You have to be a person with a disability, 65 or older, incarcerated, or out of the county for the entirety of early voting and election day. And then TCRP has a lawsuit that we filed in 2019 pending before the US Supreme Court right now. Actually, we're hoping they grant cert around the lack of process for comparing signatures on your vote by mail ballot versus what's in your file. And believe me, I won't go into that lawsuit. I'm very much a litigator at heart. I could go on all day, but just suffice to say that we're representing both community groups and Texas voters who have had their ballots trashed because, and this is a description under oath, people who are essentially volunteers with the elections department and the ballot board eyeballed their signature and decided it didn't match and tossed it in the trash. And so that predated 2020. And then on top of that, the law that was passed last year in Texas imposes new ID requirements. And specifically what it says is that whatever ID you put on your vote by mail application and ballot have to exactly match whatever's in your file. And so the thing that keeps really tricking people is, maybe they registered to vote 20 years ago with their social security number, and now they're voting and they put down their Texas driver's license. Well, those are different numbers. They're not going to match. And it's hard, even the election officials know that it's Mimi Marziani who's trying to vote. And under the state law, they cannot certify that ballot. And so, as you noted in the primary, that led to 25,000 ballots being discarded. And these were 25,000 Texas voters that, as far as TCRP can tell, were otherwise eligible voters. So a huge impact. I will say, I hope that impact will be mitigated this election. TCRP and other organizations have been working very closely with county election officials. Honestly, many of the urban counties have been spending additional money. They have money to put into elections to hire more temporary staff, to reach out to voters, to try to solve this problem and get voters to correct their ballot. But it is, it's worrisome, and there is absolutely no point to these new ID requirements more point, at least as far as I can tell. But I think that it could not be more of a difference from these places where they are sending every voter a ballot. That is a wild gap.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's so different for a voter who is having their mail ballot tossed because of implementation issues with a new unnecessary law versus a state where you receive your ballot in the mail and you can drop it off at a drop box, and it's just the level of access difference there is extreme, and it's growing. And I think that I love that you bring up that we're talking about all these new laws, and there are consequences that we can predict about those laws, and then there are also all of these implementation issues that come up with laws that are either poorly written or quickly executed, and that is a form of policy also, right? When we've got all these implementation issues and the litigation that you mentioned, it makes policy across the country. We see these in Wisconsin, for example, they passed no new laws, but through litigation we're seeing significant restrictions and mail voting this year in the state. And, litigation can kind of work both ways that way, where it can kind of create expansive and restrictive policy. And I feel like we're almost where my job ends at the policy making stage. Your job begins at the litigation stage.
Well, I'll say, at TCRP, we actually do a fair amount of, especially
right, yeah,
on Texas state law issues. We do some, it's not so much legislative counseling, although we will work with lawmakers, but we do a lot of what I always think of it as translation, that when a complicated piece of legislation is proposed in areas of our expertise, that we can comb through it and then explain it to, first and foremost, people who are going to be impacted in the community, but also the press and other stakeholders. And all the other things you could say about the omnibus legislation that was passed last year, SB1, it was a massive, deeply complicated election bill that reached into all corners of the election code. And because it was introduced on the very last day that a bill could be introduced, the hearings were rushed. It had obviously been declared a priority of state leadership. And, I agreed with most of the substance of that policy, but there were also just real process concerns, including, legislative hearings where it was clear that lawmakers themselves, most of them did not know the contents of the bill, which, again, like whether or not you think it's a good bill or a bad bill, I think should concern people. And I'd love to hear, what do you guys step into that gap at all? Do you work with lawmakers specifically to help them really understand these complicated pieces of legislation?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's such an important piece of this, right? Because there is this kind of, state lawmakers are often not well staffed, and they're dealing with just thousands of pieces of legislation that are coming through. And yeah, often there is kind of an information gap. These are complicated laws, there's a lot of information there. And I think in some cases they really rely on, like, as you were saying, like groups with some expertise to kind of explain, not just to advocate, just to explain what the bill does, so that there's a full understanding of its implications. And I'll say, I mentioned that I worked on gun violence prevention in kind of my previous job, and one of the first areas I started working on gun violence prevention shortly after the shooting of Trayvon Martin. And so I worked a lot on stand your ground legislation. And one of the really shocking things that really drew me to work on state legislation was that so many of the legislators who passed that legislation across the country, and so many of the governors who signed it, really had no idea what it did. Yeah. Like, very truly had no idea what it did. And that is a huge gap, and something that we definitely really strive to fill at Voting Rights Lab, is that kind of information gap, just to explain what the contents of a piece of legislation are.
Yeah. That made me think of something that over the course of my career, I have done, other things with my career, but there has been a very solid through line of voting rights and elections at this point since 2008. So for about 15 years. And one thing that does make me very sad about this area of the law is how politically charged it's gotten, and what an effect that's had on policy. And one example I always think of along those lines is in 2011, I was part of a team, I was at the Brennan Center then, that sued South Carolina over their then new photo ID law. And at the time, their photo ID law had a provision for a reasonable impediment declaration that you could fill out if you did not have a proper ID. Well, now, for people who are more familiar with this area of the law, reasonable impediment has actually, this idea has made its way into most of the strict photo ID laws, including Texas's. But at the time, it was kind of this invention of somebody in South Carolina. And during our litigation, we deposed dozens of lawmakers who had either voted for the bill, had opposed it, but they had all been part of the legislative process. And one of the questions was, what does that mean? And nobody, it was not a defined term. And so it just always left me thinking about that like people had very hardened positions on something like photo ID that was, largely informed by their political party. And because it had become so politicized, people weren't even asking common sense questions like, what does that mean? Like, what does a voter have to show to not be disenfranchised in this situation? And I think there are relatively common sense policy answers to that, but it was, it wasn't until after the bill was passed that anybody really started contemplating that question. And I will say, on the other point of Texas, or not just Texas, but Texas has a part-time legislature. So we meet every 2 years, 4 months. The lawmakers get paid very little, their staff's, very sparse. And it is, I think that even for well-meaning lawmakers, like they just can't possibly get the expertise that they need to in all of these areas of the law, just given that's the structure of the legislature.
Yeah, I'll say Texas alone, because it's only meets every other year, we see a big difference in our tracker on the years that yeah. Texas is in session. There's a lot of legislation gets moved because they only meet every other year. But yeah, I think that the issues around mail voting have become very politicized, as you say, and that wasn't true just a few years ago. Even around mail voting, it was all the research indicates that it is used pretty much equally among the parties, and it really just benefits voters. It gives folks more options on how to vote. For people from all walks of life, veterans, rural voters. Yeah. It doesn't need to be a political issue. But I will say I have a bit of good news on that front, which is just that not all issues are that divided in this country, and just kind of want to give a nod to in-person early voting, which is something that we have just seen tremendous progress
wildly popular
for a while, and
everywhere
including
else.
The past 2 years, right? So we've seen Kentucky, South Carolina, Missouri have all created early voting for the first time just in the past couple of years, and I think there are only 4 states left in the country that don't offer some form of in-person early voting, and it is among the issues we track, it's one where we just see a tremendous amount of bipartisan agreement, and it benefits the voters because it's more access. It's another mechanism for voters to use to cast their ballot, and so it doesn't. These issues don't need to be divisive. Is I think what the lesson there is.
I do agree with that, and actually in Texas, if trends hold steady, this election we'll see about 50% of our voters vote early before Election Day.
Yeah, and even that SB1, which you've referenced, the legislation that passed last year in Texas, although it restricted voting in many ways, and it even did restrict early voting in some ways. It also expanded early voting for some counties, where required additional hours of early voting for some counties, and that is something we saw in Georgia as well. They had a piece of omnibus legislation that was fairly restrictive in most ways, but did include some expansions on early voting. And I think it's just notable to see that we. This is an area that as a country, we all agree on, and we should kind of, continue to make progress in those spaces where we agree.
I agree. All right, going back to Tuesday, what do you think? I mean, is anything making you nervous? Are there trends that you think are particularly worrisome? Tell us about those.
Yeah, and I'd actually like to hear your thoughts on this in Texas in particular. One of the trends that we've seen emerge over this past couple of years is apart from voter access issues, we're seeing this new trend emerge around election interference, where states are passing legislation that actually interferes with a nonpartisan elections process. And, that includes, things like criminalizing election officials who are really just doing their job in good faith, which is contributing to the exodus of professionals who've been doing these jobs for decades.
Yeah, I don't know if you knew this, but there's a county in Central Texas here where the entirety of the elections office quit this summer.
I actually didn't hear about that story, but yeah, that is exactly.
They were getting death threats because they're getting
death threats, and they're being threatened by their own legislatures. Like that's and these are folks who are just who are doing administrative jobs that have largely not been given a lot of public attention, but are just kind of necessary for our democracy. And we're seeing those folks leave, and that's concerning because they are professionals with so much experience. And we're also kind of seen as a part of that an empowerment of partisan poll watchers. And in Texas, we saw those two trends really kind of intersect, where we saw SB1 both gave additional authority to poll watchers and at the same time restricted the ability of those election officials to remove disruptive poll watchers, and even going so far as to impose criminal penalties for doing so.
And it also created more other criminal liabilities, new ones for election workers as well, which is something that I've heard from a lot of election workers that, it's not just that they're getting threatened. It's not just that they're getting harassed. There's a liability. And at the end of the day, I mean, these are, administrators who don't get, it's not like they're not making a, private law firm salary. Like, these people are not, Yeah. I think that is very worrisome.
Yeah. And that's so, I mean, that is one of the things that I'm concerned about this election, and I'm watching. And, in Texas in particular, where we saw a lot of this type of election interference and poll watcher empowerment, like, these new policies pass. I know a lot of folks have their eyes on Texas there. And I'm sure that you guys have your ear to the ground and are talking to people.
Yes. And those are absolutely two big, I would say, the continued concerns over voting by mail and these ID requirements, and then this kind of, and they're different, but they do tend to converge. On election day, they'll basically converge. The fact that many of our elections offices are short-staffed, people feel like they're at the end of the rope, that they haven't, that they're being targeted all over the place. And then partisan poll watchers having new powers, it's more difficult to remove them. And, we know that there are third party, although, I usually kind of outside of the major party system, but political in nature, there's groups that are, training poll watchers, and I fear doing so in a way that is maximizing the potential for disruption. So the other thing I would point to, and then we'll go to some audience questions. Another trend that we see in Texas, and I'd be curious as to whether you're seeing this across the rest of the country, is we are seeing an increasing conflict between local election officials and the state. And now Texas is unique in, all states do this a little bit differently, but Texas does not have a state election board. And while the Secretary of State is the head election official by statute, the Secretary of State for a long time has claimed kind of varying levels of responsibility and authority over the county elections folks. And, whether you agree with that or not, the county election officials here in Texas have traditionally exercised quite a bit of discretion in, fulfilling their jobs. And particularly on things like polling place hours and polling place locations and poll worker training. And, some of that TCRP and I have pushed back about over the years, because you do want there to be more of a consistency for voters. What we've seen in the last couple of years in particular, and Harris County is the flashpoint, although Travis County, home to Austin, also tends to get a fair amount of publicity, is local election officials that are now taking that authority and innovating, being creative, looking at what other big cities are doing, LA or Chicago, and importing kind of new pro-voter strategies, and then having the state come in and they're butting heads about, whether or not that is a good idea or whether or not that's permissible under law. And I think the most high profile example of this from 2020 was when Harris County decided to do what it called drive-through voting. So these were actual voting machines, just their normal voting machines. They were just placed in parking garages, as I understand it, so that people were driving instead of walking up, and then they would park their car, vote, and then they drive off. And it was very, very popular. 130,000 people voted that way in Harris County. It was also in the middle of COVID. But there was a huge, there was lots of litigation, and there's just a big dispute about whether or not that was permissible under law. And then that was one of the other things that SB1 arguably rolled back, I guess, depending on your view of the law, was saying that that was prohibited. But now we see kind of a different iteration of this, that the state, without much evidence, is claiming that Harris County had irregularities in their counting during the primary, and that they're going to send not just election observers, which is fairly routine, but that the AG's office is going to send a task force to, I guess, monitor election. It's a little unclear, but it's, kind of on top of this like push-pull between the state and the county, intimidation of election workers, intimidation of voters, and then, of course, we have statewide elections this year. So the AG who's sending this roaming task force is on the ballot himself, creating a conflict of interest. So that is the other thing that we are going to keep a close eye on as we go into election day is, just the relationship between the variety of, I think that's the most, the most benign way to say it, kind of the relationship between all of these actors in the system, and especially how that relationship can get kind of dicey when they're at odds with each other.
Yeah, I think that's also, a part of a larger trend that we're seeing nationally where, county election officials are kind of being stripped of their power to innovate, as you put it, to create, to work within the law to create a system that works best for their locality.
That area. Right.
So there are certainly, minimum standards that should exist in every state in terms of what access should look like. But, there is a tremendous variation within any given state in terms of, what the way folks vote, in rural counties versus like more populous counties. There's just the difference in terms of what might be needed to meet every voter's needs. And there should certainly be a floor that, that sets that access. I'm not sure I see a disadvantage to, Harris County offering 24-hour voting, for example, if that's, if that works, if that's popular in that county. And I do see the county, election officials are really being stripped of a lot of that discretion to the point where they are, as I mentioned earlier, being subject to criminal penalties for for behavior that used to be legal. We're seeing, states pass these laws that actually make it illegal for an election official to send a ballot to, or even a ballot application to a voter who didn't specifically request it. And that those types of, criminal threats are just kind of, are obviously adding another layer of intimidation for these election officials who are already under scrutiny and receiving death threats. And it's just these are not political positions. These are positions where, their goal was to, create, an election that worked for the folks that lived in their county. And that's what they've been doing successfully for a long time. And so it's kind of, I can see why it's why they're finding staying in those positions challenging right now.
Oh, 1,000%. I mean, TCRP, full disclosure, we sue the state a fair amount, but we also sue the counties around voting stuff in particular. And even folks that I've had, pretty deep disagreements with, to the point of being in active litigation, I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for these county election officials. I think that they have been put in a really difficult position. And I agree with you. If there's kind of one thing that I'm nervous about going into Tuesday, it's just all of these factors coming together. And I just, I hope everything holds for that big day.
And I think it's also just like worth noting that it's not, these election interference policies are not something that voters agree with. Like when, even polling in, battleground states, we're seeing that the vast majority of voters, they trust their election officials and they trust that they can and will run a fair and impartial election. It isn't the voters, it isn't the citizens who want to see these, these new penalties and these new restrictions placed on their election officials. For the most part, folks really trust their local election officials. And I think that is a way that some of these state legislatures are really out of step with their constituents.
Oh, I agree. And I think that's another thing that was really striking about the legislative battle in Texas last year was, I think one reason that lawmakers hadn't read the bill that was being proposed was because it was very complicated and, the time and short-staffed, all that, which are all fairly legitimate reasons. I think the other reason is it was, after a lot of questioning of lawmakers and a lot of work at the Capitol, our best understanding is that bill was imported from some other state, some national group. It was really unclear who actually wrote the bill. I think that's why you see similarities with other states. And, while, it can be helpful sometimes to get best practices, I guess, looking around nationally. It was really clear to me being very involved in that legislative fight that, it was absolutely not Texas constituents who wanted to ratchet up criminal penalties on their local friendly election officials. Like, this was not coming from the people that lawmakers are supposed to represent. It was coming from somewhere else. All right. So with that, though, I see we have a great question in the chat. So I want to pose this to you, Liz. It says, you mentioned in-person early voting. Are there other areas of agreement or other best practices that Voting Rights Lab is helping to promote?
Yeah, early voting is one of those areas where, I mentioned that we were seeing just kind of, a lot of agreement across the country and really a lot of forward progress made in terms of expanding access to in-person early voting. There are other areas that are similar to that. Some of the kind of details around mail voting, actually, as divisive as mail voting has been, and as much as we've seen states headed in opposite directions, there are some of the details around mail voting that we actually are seeing a lot of momentum and agreement. One of those areas is around giving election officials additional time to start processing mail ballots. One of the reasons why we saw some delays in 2020 was that in many states, election officials weren't allowed to even start processing, verifying the validity of the mail ballot envelopes until election day, and sometimes even until like the end of election day. And so it is really kind of critical that those election officials have the opportunity to begin that process earlier. And we've seen many states across the political spectrum across the country passing legislation to give election officials more time to process ballots, which both will help prevent election delays, but also kind of leading into another area where we're seeing some agreement. It also gives election officials more time to notify voters if there's kind of a minor error on their absentee ballot envelope. If there is, for example, if the voter forgot to date the envelope, or in some cases forgot to sign it, forgot to, or if their signature doesn't match the one on file because it's older, they get it verifying these ballots earlier gives election officials a chance to let voters know that there's a problem with their absentee ballot, and gives them a chance to fix it so that the ballot will be counted.
And I will say, that is a good thing about Texas law does allow that, which is, I agree with you, very, very positive. And as I also said, my hat is also off to a lot of the counties that have been really working with their ballot boards to make sure that there's additional training this year because there's a new law. And I do believe we'll see all the numbers when it settles, but I personally believe it's going to lead to thousands and thousands of voters being able to correct their ballots and ultimately have them counted.
Yeah, and that that process of kind of letting voters know about the problems with their ballots so they can fix them is sometimes called a cure process, and it is one of those issues that we have seen states pass legislation around, exclusively in a positive direction since 2020. And it was actually one of the good provisions in SB1 where the legislature kind of created that cure process in Texas. And I think that is it is an area that's, I would say, best practices around mail voting in terms of ensuring that folks' votes are counted, and it is an area where we're seeing progress.
Yeah. All right, we have another good question in the chat. Oof, this is a hard one. It goes back to something I said in the way beginning. How do we depoliticize the issue of voting rights and election administration?
The best way I know how is through that, by filling that information gap that we were talking about earlier, like just really providing data, providing information about what these policies are, showing that they're not designed to benefit one party or another, and they don't benefit one party or another. These are these policies around increasing options for voters, benefits folks from across both parties and everything in between, and people from all just from all walks of life. And like that is one thing that we are learning more and more. As I mentioned earlier, it's just that voting is not one size fits all, and we need to offer these options, and that they do not benefit one party over another. And also, I think showing the more polling that is done of the legislators' constituents, I think is helpful, just so folks know like where the people who they are beholden to and holding this office on behalf of, knowing where they stand on these issues, I think is also is also critical. But I don't know if you have any kind of other thoughts here.
I agree with all of that. Something else is, I feel very strongly that there needs to be more national attention and investment on setting, I think to use a word you rightly use, setting a floor and having a greater degree of consistency across states. Because, and I think also with that, probably, it's been a long time since the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which was the last time that we really had federal attention on issues of voting machine technology and security. And, there obviously is stuff happening at the federal level, but I think that having a greater consistency of election administration standards and then a, kind of new look and federal investment on voting machine technology with an extra look at cybersecurity and the things that I think everybody should be very, very concerned about. And I would also throw in prohibition on partisan gerrymandering and some guidelines around gerrymandering, which, look, depending on your state, that's going to hurt Democrats in New York. It's going to hurt Republicans in Texas. But I think that overall, it'll make voters have a better understanding of what the baseline rules are. And I think ultimately more confidence in the process. One thing, I have absolutely, I think there is no room ever for political violence. And I think there were really wretched ramifications of the harassment, even if it didn't escalate to violence, that we saw of election officials in 2020 and the aftermath. One thing I will say I have some maybe sympathy for is, I've spent a long time as, from a partisan angle, from a nonpartisan angle, from more of an academic angle, looking at the way we administer elections. And there's a lot of things that are messy. And I think that there is a lot that we could do, again, to invest more money, professionalize, standardize, allow for local innovations. And I personally think that would go a long way towards increasing, both confidence and also hopefully kind of pulling this out of, the realm of constant political fighting and more into a place of, kind of wonky best practice policymaking.
Yeah, that's keep elections wonky.
Exactly.
Let's focus on the policy.
And I think we are kind of out of time. Veronica, do you are. Do we have time for one more question, or do you want to wrap us?
Well, why don't you offer your closing thoughts as we head to Election Day? What are the things you're thinking about in these final days?
Yeah, I think that, we're looking to see, we're watching the election. We're looking to see what happens. We're looking to see what happens in the states that expanded access and what happens in those states that kind of restricted access this past year. And are watching closely in states where the nonpartisan administration of elections has been disrupted, and kind of keeping our eye out for where there are areas where we can do better next time. But to be clear, we expect this to be this election to be fair and impartial, and that's kind of what the polling is showing too, is that that's what voters expect to see. And we're kind of just keeping our eye out and collecting data.
Yeah, I think the thing I would say, because I know that we have a lot of lawyers in Texas, law students in Texas watching this. The Texas Civil Rights Project spearheads a nonpartisan election protection network. We are statewide, we have national partners, and we coordinate with, 200 community groups on the ground. We've already trained hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. We run a hotline. We have legal boiler rooms ready to intervene and help voters if and when it becomes necessary now and on Election Day. And so I would just ask everybody, first and foremost, to vote. If you haven't voted, should be easy. I agree. If you run into any problems, you can call 866-OUR-VOTE. That's OURVOTE. Our team will help answer any of those questions. And if you look at our website, I believe I think we still have at least 1 or 2 more trainings if you would like to volunteer with us on election day. And, I would, whether it's this election day or one in the future, I think the issues that we've been talking about are of critical importance to all of us. There's a lot you can do right here in Texas to make sure that elections are smooth and secure and everybody can cast a ballot that counts. So I would encourage people to keep an eye out for ways that they can get involved.
Thank you, Liz and Mimi, really appreciate it. And I hope people will answer your call to action to vote, no matter how they do that and wherever they are. And if you want to learn more about Liz's work and Mimi's work, you can visit Voting Rights Lab or the Texas Civil Rights Project. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned, our program has been approved for an hour of CLE credit by the State Bar of Texas. If you're joining us by Zoom, you will get an email with the information about how to claim that credit. And if you're joining us, if you're one of the folks who have been listening on the phone, just email us at Center for Women in Law at law.utexas.edu, and we'll make sure that you get your credit. I hope you'll join the Center for Women in Law for future events, and please consider supporting us. We are very grateful for all your help. And in the chat, you'll see a link to our giving page. You can follow us on social media and our website for all our upcoming programs and events. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Thank you all so much.